was one question that the Arts Center had. Who exactly are these multiple communities that we are serving when our immediate neighborhood looks like this?
Indigenous communities don't need us as performing arts centers. They have their own centers.
Well, good to see you all back from lunch. I truly hope we don't put you to sleep, but I'm sure we won't, because it's a really distinguished panel that we have here to discuss this issue of, and we have taken seriously this idea of mind the gap, and we've thought about gap analysis, if you will, in terms of how we all work to best effect with our communities, or don't, if that's the case, and what we might be able to do about it. Finally, we're in one other area, market area. We have a 1,500-seater theatre in that downtown area, and it's really quite a student quarter. A lot of foreign students, a big Chinese community there, and really we have to think very strongly as programmers how we program to cater and attract that intercultural audience. And it's a big issue for a country like Australia, because we are, a country of many, many, many different cultures. And then finally, the overlay of all of that is this land is traditional land of First Nations people who have been on that land for 40,000, maybe more years. And in particular, where our big art centre is built, that was a ceremonial area for the local young people. How do we interface with that? How do we mind the gap in that respect? That is a really big issue. And of course, I know it's one that's being dealt with here in Taiwan and Canada, and of course, many communities across the world.
Just to give you a quick sense of what Esplanade is, this image of Esplanade more or less gives you a sense of the lay of the land for this art center. We're not just performing venues. There's a list of performing venues that are in there, but we are about more than 30 shops and restaurants. There are gardens as well. We have lots of public spaces. Buses, I like to think of us really as a civic space. How do we even define community when we look at where we are? So the two domes, the two durians, that's our two main halls. Our community is 30 to an hour MRT ride away from Esplanade. Our communities, I use that in plural, because we serve multiple communities. So that was one question that the Arts Center had. Who exactly are these multiple communities that we are serving when our immediate neighborhood looks like this? But the problem is, how do you attract and engage everyone if you have to travel 30 to 60 minutes to get here? And you can't have fireworks every night. When you have fireworks, it's packed, right? But you can't. You have fireworks maybe twice in a year. So what do? And the first point that we had from very day one was to try to create a calendar, an annual year-round calendar that is not about what we want, but what each community that we're trying to serve, what they are doing at that point in the year. And we bring the arts into that point of the annual calendar. We do that for 1 year, and we keep repeating it until hopefully different communities build a kind of habit of taking their high point into the Arts Center and celebrating their high point with us. Always trying to create a sense of ownership over time for the communities to actually take over the space. This happens during our children's festival. It's called March On, and it happens in March, of course. But in this particular case, we created a space, or we allowed these children to take over the festival, or this spot on the festival, every year for the last 3 years. These kids come from a neighborhood that is, I would say, financially not as well off. There is an arts company that works with these children, and every year we say to them, you run your mini festival in our festival. So these activities are entirely designed by the kids, and they are the ones who perform, who curate it, who do the MC, who, they are the front of house as well. So ownership and having communities actually bring themselves into the center and decide what is it that they want to do is the third thing that we've been encouraging. And the last thing I would say is that as we're creating all this, at the back of the minds of the programmers and many of us, we're also always thinking, how do we make sure that 2 or 3 communities meet at our space? I end with this slide because I think, again, Taiwanese audiences know this well enough, but it's a temple ritual. And we, in today's world, religion is so sensitive. So one of the most precious festivals to us is Tapestry, sacred pop music. And we actually take sacred rituals from churches, temples, even saying our prayers into our public space. And audiences of all backgrounds get to experience a multitude of religions in a non-religious secular space.
So how do you relate to the community, your community of artists? I mean, how do you make that work?
So I'm about 90 kilometers outside of Vancouver. Everyone knows where Vancouver is. In a beautiful valley. I have visited Taipei and Singapore and on a vacation and made the kind of wanted to visit art centers. I came here at the National Theatre, the Star Performing Arts Center, and then the Esplanade. And I'm seeking answers. I'm seeking ways of doing things that I can take to Chilliwack. And Chilliwack is where the word comes from. Chilliwack is an indigenous word, Chilliwack. And so we have a vibrant indigenous community that's part of our area. And I'm a small performing arts center, like tiny compared to the massive centers that seem to be represented here. I have a 575 seat theater and then a smaller black box seat theater. And in a community of 100,000, we're really the only performing arts entity there. And so the questions that I had that came to mind when I was thinking of this topic related to community is how do I in this small framework engage the artistic community? How do we engage the diversity? So Chilliwack is one of the fastest growing cities in British Columbia. A lot of people are moving out of Vancouver because it's too expensive in some respects, and finding communities like the one that I live in. And then diversity, and then indigenous relationships. And I thought I'd just pull a couple of slides from things that we've done when I think of cultivating relationships with the artistic community. This is a group out of Vancouver called Renaissance Opera, Re-Opera. It's a young group of BIPOC artists, so Black, Indigenous, and people of color artists. We invited them to come out of Vancouver to our center to do a residency, to be given access to our space. The space in Vancouver is so expensive, and Re-Opera pulls people from Los Angeles, Toronto, and Vancouver. And it's a young group of people, and the question that they had was, what if classic opera like the Orpheus and Eurydice story was a video game? And so they worked collaboratively to have dancers perform dance movements that are projected onto the screen. They created the underworld of the Orpheus and Eurydice story on a screen, and then opera singers, there's motion capture that captures the movement of their face that's also projected onto the screen, and there's a bank of computers that just lined the side of the stage that was running all of this. And the other reason that I like what we did here and working with them is empowering young creatives, young BIPOC creatives to do work, to create work that is also meaningful. And then the other key point for me is creating relationships with indigenous communities. We heard a little bit about it here in Taiwan, how cultural identity was stripped away from indigenous peoples, and them rediscovering that. With us as a performing arts center, I think we struggle with the question of how do we do indigenous engagement. The reality is, in our city, which is only 100,000 people, there's actually 8 indigenous communities that the city has actually grown into, pushed against, and those communities actually are now part of the city. How do we engage that particular community, but also engage the broader post-Salish indigenous community in our area? And it's not an easy It's not an easy question for me to answer, for us to answer, because Indigenous communities don't need us as performing arts centers. They have their own centers. They don't have a word for performing arts. And so we've had to try and figure out, like, what do we do for that community? And I kind of shifted it to actually being responsible for sharing with non-Indigenous people the importance of the Indigenous community that we have in Chilliwack. And so, yeah, that's kind of Chilliwack, and also, I guess, some of the things, the reason why I'm here, I'm trying to find answers to Indigenous engagement, which I think Taiwan is fantastic for, and how do you better engage diversity, which is so inspiring with Singapore.
So I'm Greg Scarpella, the director of the Global Cultural Districts Network, GCDN for short. I've been calling it the AAPPAC for Cultural District. Our aim is to really give back to the field, basically, aggregate the knowledge that our members hold and try to make sense of it, and then to bring it back to the sector. And otherwise it's a network. There's a lot of communication, connections, and so when I was looking at the questions that made part of the description of this session, how can cultural venues become a bridge between international arts and local culture? How can they prosper with their surrounding communities and neighborhood? As being part of that ecosystem, understand your position within that ecosystem, which is, I think, something that you both have done quite well. It was a very humble position from the Chilliwack Cultural Center to say, Indigenous people don't need us. Well, you understood that. So you're trying to be something else than, the cultural center for them, and trying to provide a platform, etc. And Yvonne, when you looked at the map of Singapore and were like, where am I placed? Where is my community? That was also an exercise in understanding your place. And from that understanding, engage all of your stakeholders meaningfully. And by all, it means very much, from your financiers and your board, all the way down to, all the way to your, local vendors, the people that sell hot dogs in your plaza, but also your artists, be they professional or semi-professional, because that's something we talked about yesterday in planning. Really engage them in conversation to be part of, that ecosystem. And again, I think, your first slide on programming, I really spoke to that, because rather than trying to impose a programming, you decided to build the programming around an organic calendar that existed for the communities around you. And I thought that was, really, really smart, a very smart way to go about programming. Promote accessibility in all its forms. So accessibility, when we think about accessibility, we can think about, obviously, accessibility of space. It also means monetary, financially accessible programming. So try and make it, when you're doing outreach programming, try and make it as free as possible. I know it's not always possible because financial constraints, are a challenge sometimes, but if you can, make it as free as possible. And then strive for constancy and steadfastness. I've added that word there because I think in yesterday's planning, we were talking about the challenging of being constant. So it's really about being steadfast, no matter the pushback that you may get internally from the various stakeholders that you have. Believe in what you're doing. If you see that there is potential, of course, you're allowed to change your mind. But believe in it because, again, going back to something that you had in one of your slides, repeat. Give people the habit to come to your place, to see those programs, to engage with them on a regular basis, year after year after year after year. And I think we were talking yesterday. You said that it was 10 years now down the road, and they're suddenly starting to feel like the Esplanade belongs to them. And that was built upon 10 years already of planning. So it's 20 years in total for something to really take, for the roots to really take. TPAC is 2 years old for all intents and purposes, so we'll see how that develops, and it may take longer, it may take a shorter time, but I think this constancy and that steadfastness is really important in making that happen. And then sustainability, obviously in all its forms, that's also very important, especially with the current state of the world. So, we can go into details more. But I guess all of that is, secondary to intention. Because intention is really key. you have to do it. You figure out what you're going to do it, and then you do it. It sounds a bit duh, but at the end of the day, it would be very easy, especially for big organizations like Performing Arts Centers tend to be. You have overhead, you have lots of internal challenges. It feels almost natural that in a situation like the world is today, the context of multi-crisis like the world is living, you would have the tendency to look inwardly and try to consolidate the assets that you have and save the programs that you feel dear about, and trying to carry on as you were, because this is what we've been doing, this is our mission, we want to stay true to that. The way that you're going to continue existing is by building the roots, it's by continuing to implant yourself into that ecosystem. So yeah, intention is key, and I guess I was inspired in that last bit by the second part of the title, mind the gap, lead the path. I think that's the important part of it.